Welcome back to the 6th Gear Garage. Today, I'm replacing the front strut assembly on this 2011 Ford Edge, and I'm going to do it without removing the entire cowl to save a lot of time and labor. I'm only showing the passenger side in this video, but it's always recommended to replace both sides at the same time. If one is failing, usually the other isn't far behind. First, I'm cracking the lug nuts loose while the vehicle's on the ground. Then, lifting the front with a jack and using jack stands to safely support the vehicle. These are the two bolts that attach the strut to the knuckle, so I'm going to spray them with some lube and let them soak because everything rusts here in Ohio. Brake line bolt will need to come out for sure. Under the hood here, there are the 4 nuts that hold the strut assembly to the strut tower. It's pretty tight back in here. I've been told that I need to remove the entire cowl to access these bolts. I'm going to try to keep it in place. But I'll give these guys a little spray to hopefully help them come out easier. The one in the back corner is going to be the challenge. The strut and spring are still in good shape, but I'm replacing the entire assembly because the bearing up top is going bad. I'll go into details on that later. Let's crack these nuts loose with this closed-in wrench. They're all 1/2 inch. First, I'm going to get this rubber line out of the way. This is for the windshield washers on the hood. Getting this plastic clip apart without destroying it might be the most challenging part of all this. The driver's side has a little more room to work. I'm also using a crescent wrench to access the bolts where the boxed end won't slide over. So this is a slow process. I'm getting about a 1/4 turn each time, but it's still less work than removing the entire cowl. I'd rather work slower than work harder and have half of the plastic screw clips strip out or break on me. It turns out I didn't need to remove the cowl, saving a lot of labor. I was even able to fit a ratcheting wrench on the nut after it was partially loosened, which sped up the process. So the back one is off and the other one is almost off. I actually need to let the strut drop a little so I can have more room to get a wrench on that nut. Also, don't drop any of these nuts because if they fall into the abyss behind the shock tower, I'm not sure if you'll ever see them again. I'm leaving this front one on a little bit to keep the whole strut assembly from falling down when I'm unbolting it from the knuckle under the car. Plus, when it drops a little, I can finish removing that back one. Looking down here, before I remove these 2 big nuts, I have a wire for the ABS sensor that needs to come off of the strut. And over here, there's this 10mm bolt that holds the brake line in place. Now I've got a 24mm socket on a breaker bar to loosen these 2 nuts from the bolts that hold the strut to the knuckle. The long breaker bar makes these easy to break loose. Now, I just need to tap the bolts out with a hammer. It doesn't take much effort. And the strut is no longer connected to the knuckle. I still have the strut barely attached up top, but that gives enough play to allow me to move it around some. I don't want to pull the knuckle out too far because the CV joint inside this rubber boot could separate. If the CV joint comes apart, that's a whole nother headache. So I only remove the knuckle enough to get it out of the way of the strut. Now, with the strut ready to drop, I have a little more room to remove that back nut. This whole assembly is hanging by a few threads. Time to let it drop. A second set of hands is helpful here. I've got one on the strut and I'm loosening the last nut with the other hand. And it's through. Right now, it's just resting on the axle for a minute until I set down the camera. Just make sure not to get caught on the brake line. And careful not to scrape any of the 4 studs on top of the strut on the edge of the fender. Unlike a double wishbone suspension, this design only uses a lower control arm, and the bottom of the strut attaches to the knuckle. So, when the knuckle turns to steer the wheel, the whole strut has to turn with it, the spring and everything. Where it mounts to the shock tower has to be stationary because it's part of the body. So, this is a separate plate at the top and is connected to the strut with a rotating bearing inside underneath it. The bearings in that plate allow it to rotate smoothly, but wear out over time, and that's when you hear a clunk noise when turning. usually at the same position of the steering wheel. Over time, this will just get worse and clunk more. I had a Chevy Beretta back in the day, and the bearings were so bad that after I turned onto a road, the car would slightly pull the last way I turned, until I turned the other way at the next road. Then it would pull that direction. Rather than rent a spring compressor and do all that sketchy work to replace just the bearings, it's a fraction of the time to just replace the entire assembly. Plus, everything is brand new now. Here's the new and old one side by side. These are left and right specific because of the brackets for the brake lines. The new strut came with new nuts. Installation is pretty much the opposite of removal. I have the strut sitting on the axle. Some of the threads are through the shock tower. I'll just put one nut on for now to keep it from falling down. I'll speed through the other 3 nuts because it took some time, but still easier than removing the entire cowl for better access. I'm using a variety of wrenches, some open end, some boxed end, and some angled. I use the ratcheting ones when possible to save time. Putting the new nuts on was actually easier than removing the original ones because they're slightly smaller at the base. You can see the worn paint from the original nut, and the new one is about 1/16, maybe 1/8 inch smaller overall diameter. So that gives a little more room to get these 1/2 inch nuts tightened. Just hand tight for now, so I can still have some play to get the strut lined up on the knuckle. Here's a tip. 13mm and 1/2 inch are very close in size. The 13mm is slightly bigger, barely, like maybe 1/32 of an inch. But you can usually use one for the other if needed. Because the 13mm is slightly bigger than the 1/2 inch, it's going to slide on and off the nut easier in a tight space and allow for a little extra play. So these nuts, where I only have room to do less than a 1/4 turn at a time, I use the 13mm instead of the 1/2 inch because I can throw the 13mm wrench on the 1/2 inch nut in a lot less time because it doesn't have to go over it exactly straight on to fit. It's a minor detail, but ends up saving time when space is too tight to use a ratcheting wrench, which are usually thicker. So you get your 13mm wrenches along with 1/2 inch for this job because it does make it go faster with all these nuts in tight spaces. Here's an angled wrench. This is helpful to tighten the rear nuts because the wrench angles up and clears the ones in the front. And that means I can get more swing each time, which also speeds things up. And then here's a ratcheting wrench. Huge time saver, but it is a lot thicker than a plain boxed in wrench because of the ratcheting parts inside. So it's not always useful in the tight spots. Now I need to attach the bottom of the strut to the knuckle. Just get the holes lined up pretty close. The bolt is beveled on the end, so I can just wiggle it in a little bit. Then some taps with a hammer. Get that brake line out of the way. That's good. And repeat for the lower bolt. Then just put the nuts on hand tight for now. Next, I can tighten these 24mm nuts to 166 foot-pounds. Snap in this clip for the ABS sensor. I need to reuse this 10mm bolt for the brake line. I'm not sure on the torque specs for this one. I just go hand tight, maybe 15 foot-pounds. Back up on the strut tower. Now I can tighten these 4 bolts to 26 foot-pounds. Put this washer hose back in its plastic holder. And then I reinstalled the wheels, lowered the edge back on the ground, and torqued the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and consider subscribing for more how-to videos and project vehicle updates here at the 6th Gear Garage. Looking down here, before I remove these 2 big nuts, I have a... Jeez, what am I, like 12 today? Third time's a charm.